And I'm going to go on mute.
Okay. Broadcast has started. You're now live. Okay. Will we see the attendees? Let me just check out the attendees list real quick here. There we go. We got a bunch of people. Hey, everyone. All right, let's get started. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today. So I'm hoping you kind of had a chance to network and kind of take a break and everything. So today we're going to talk, or in this talk, I'm going to go over the product-led growth example from the B2B space, and specifically from the Azure Storage line. Before we go into the talk itself, just want to call out a couple of sessions here that worth checking out. So one was already earlier today at 10:30. That was given by Brett on she's the product chief growth officer at Kinzu. And she gave a talk on how important the onboarding is in the overall process. And then the other one, led by Chris later today, right after I think this session, also highly recommend, because I think my talk and Brett's talk are mostly around very kind of specific examples and kind of case studies, if you will. And then Chris is going to go much broader and give you kind of this end-to-end kind of PLG framework, if you will. So highly recommend for sure. A couple of heads ups. So I'll try to check out the chat every once in a while and ask questions. Or sorry, and answer questions. And then Mike, if you see anything, please go ahead and just unmute yourself and let me know if we need to address any of the questions. And then the other heads up, real quick, thanks, is that, of course, on the day of the presentation, there has to be kind of some minor accidents here. So we have a huge construction area in my neighborhood, so I'm hoping this is not going to be causing any noise on the background, but let me know just in case. So a little bit about me. I am a principal product manager with UiPath, the robotics process automation company these days. And I joined about 2 months ago, and before that, I spent almost a decade with Microsoft, working in various kind of capacities. And I want to talk just a little bit about my experience so that you kind of can connect the dots between how my experience and how I approach certain growth problems. But the idea is that right out of college, I joined Microsoft and took over the professional services business development. So that was the situation, was that the customers would come to Microsoft asking for certain professional services help, like setting up the environment, setting up the products, and educating users on how to best use them. And we didn't have anything to offer them. And so that was the kind of first growth problem, if you will. And at the time, I kind of didn't think about it this way. It's just now, more so reflecting on the past, I figured that, hey, in actuality, I worked quite a bit on different growth problems in the past. So that was the first growth problem for me back then. It was pretty fun. I had to do lots of different things, try lots of things, and basically figure out how to grow the business and how to grow the team. And I also had nothing to lose at the time, at least when I thought, because I thought that at 20, well, if I lose the job, if I cannot do that and they don't hire me in the end, that's fine. I'll find something else. So that was first experience. And then about 5 years ago, I relocated to US and then started, that's right around 2015 when Windows 10 came up. And so I switched gears pretty dramatically in that I just got excited about the platform, about this new product, and I started traveling all over US, evangelizing Windows 10 and helping deploy it. And, I participated in one of the first 200,000 seeds deployment of Windows 10 back in the day. Like right now we have like almost 1 billion devices, but then back then it was a big deal to have like 200,000 devices deployment. So that was another growth problem for me. And I also helped create programs around and I guess packaged solutions for the customers on how to best use the products that that Microsoft had to offer at the time. So if you know this Microsoft 365 solution, which is basically a bundle of Windows 10 and Office 365. So I was kind of coming up with different workshops and different basically programs on how the customers would then help onboard that solution going forward. So like think, for example, the customers buys the Microsoft 365 solution, and then they want to educate their staff on how to use it and how to basically make best value out of it. So that was the second kind of sort of growth problem. And then finally, I about like 4-ish years ago, again, switched gears pretty dramatically in that I went all the way from this like SaaS and like very kind of front end type business to all the way to the back end to Azure Storage. And I took over the adoption problem back then, and which I'm going to talk about more today. So the overall outline of today's talk is to I just want to go over the typical growth problem that I'm sure many of you have faced or like today facing, how I approach solving it. So some of the hypotheses, some of the metrics that I thought, and what worked for me, what didn't work for me. We'll go over the results, briefly, and then some of the learnings that I extracted from this kind of experience. No, I was just checking out the chat window. So, but before that, just a real quick glimpse into my first experience and kind of some of the really tough situations that I had in my very first couple months of my career. I failed pretty miserably in that. So I just want to, want you to picture the situation for a little bit. So 2 months on the job, I was tasked with this growth problem, which I'm going to talk about in a bit. And as I was going through this problem, I was, of course, making certain decisions here and there. And in particular, I made a decision about purchasing certain hardware at the time. And again, storage involves lots of hardware. And I thought I was making a good decision because I was buying not as, basically the decision was to buy cheaper hardware, smaller hardware, because I knew that, my demand, I didn't know much about it at the time. And I thought that, saving companies some money would be a good thing to do. So that was kind of the idea of the decision. And so picture the situation. So we had these weekly meetings with different very, very high ups. You can think like corporate vice presidents and like distinguished engineers and partner directors in Microsoft, where we would, review, certain milestones and certain decisions. And basically, in one of these meetings, like on my second month, I get into the meeting and I basically declare that decision, saying, "Hey guys, we're going to be doing this," and I just casually pass by it, thinking that it's not a big deal. And at that point, one of the distinguished engineers at the time, he stands up and says that, "Well, you just created a 2 million problem for us." And after probably a couple seconds of shock, I wanted to disappear right away from that meeting and never come back again. And this is no joke that, changing the teams in the retrospect was at least the kind of, the idea that crossed my mind. But the idea was that, the new capabilities and the features and they have all, the dev cost, of course, the development cost, and, the hardware decision specifically would potentially force us to have, additional dev costs, which was pretty significant, which I didn't know about. And I didn't factor that in, and I thought that was not going to be a big problem at all. But I just wanted to give you an idea of how, some of these decisions in this growth space may turn out to be if you don't go broad enough. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the lessons learned towards the end. But yeah, that was pretty rough. So anyway, going into the problem space. So very typical one, right? Again, I just joined the team. I took over a product, which basically became available about 4 months prior to me joining. And there was near zero adoption. So you can think of, hey, there's dozens of different servers deployed around the globe, and nobody's using them, or pretty much nobody. Again, compared to at least how much capacity sits out there, right? And so, which means that effectively you're losing money because these servers are sitting out there, they're burning electricity, whatever, air conditioning, things like that. And so you're at a given point in time, your gross margin negative, right? And then the question is, what do I do? is it a problem even? And the reason I'm asking this question is because, well, we know that there are a few deals that are coming in the next 2-3 years, because there are sometimes, very long-term engagements that we have with the customers, right? And so, which means that in about maybe 2 years, we're going to fill up all these clusters, and we, don't have to even worry in the meantime. Is that okay to simply wait right now and hang out and, maybe focus on something else? And I'd love for you to guys think about it a little bit. And, maybe towards the end of the presentation, or, as we go through it, you could submit your ideas to the chat window, and we can talk about this and, see how this plays out. So the idea or, the framework was a little bit constrained in terms of how to approach this growth problem. And that's, again, my personal experience. So first of all, at Microsoft, as you can imagine, and I think in any large enterprise, the high order bit is we're making money. And so your growth implies profitable growth or path to profitability, which means that path means that even if you say that today, when I launch certain features or products, I may not be profitable, of course, right off the bat, but then I have, let's say, a 2-3 year plan as to when I'll become profitable or I'll break even. So that's one thing. So this is very important in terms of how I approach the problem overall, right? The second thing is that Azure Storage specifically is mostly mostly infrastructure as a service or platform as a service type business. So it's not so much SaaS, right? And so that's why it's heavy sales led. Which makes the entire product-led growth framework and kind of approach a little bit harder to implement. Then there's a lot of inorganic so-called customers, or like these long-term contracts that I briefly touched upon, so that are going to materialize in about like 2 to 3 years, right? So you develop that lead, you go through the different proof of concepts with the customers, and then they finally make a decision. But then the actual production deployment of any kind may only materialize in a couple of years, because there's lots of planning, lots of prerequisites that they need to first take care of, and things like that. And so, which means that sometimes your whole growth trajectory, it will have this certain upticks every 1 year, 2 year, depending on all these kind of inorganic deals. And so your growth graph looks like a little bit, or maybe not a roller coaster per se, but it's really bumpy sometimes, right? But most importantly, I think on that front about this long-term contracts is that means that you also need to be efficient from a product planning standpoint. So you want to hit that desired milestones, on time for that particular customer, because they would have some certain asks for your product, which need to materialize in this 2 to 3 year horizon. But then at the same time, you don't want to cripple your ongoing current investments as much, right? And also the other aspect of it is also, again, coming back to that problem. What do you do in the meantime? How do you also create that momentum for your product to grow organically and not only rely on these kind of large deals? And then the last piece, kind of that last kind of guardrails, if you will, of that growth framework is that the large customers, they tend to influence your product a lot, and you need to find that balance between satisfying their needs, but also making sure that you have kind of this long-term growth strategy, which again makes this whole product-led growth framework a little bit harder to implement. So again, think top 50 customers skewing your product direction quite a bit. But again, the majority of the market potentially may have a slightly different need. And so how do you unify those two, and how do you converge? And again, in the lessons learned, I'm going to talk a little bit about this. So again, the key takeaway here is that given the constraints of the large enterprise organization, and given the type of product specifically, right, I wasn't able really to do any user-focused things that you would do to encourage hypergrowth, like freemiums or self-service conversion or referral mechanisms. It's not that they're out of reach, but they're not, I guess, as effective. And so, and I think that that's the case for many who work in enterprise software or sales-driven organizations like large established companies. And so again, the question is, what do I do And I figured that I would start with kind of basically define the product-led growth on my own and basically focus on the areas that makes most sense in a given situation. So I decided to start with the very, very, very basics. And I think that, oftentimes that, when you join and, you have this kind of, you taking over the product, you're not actually launching the product from scratch, but you're taking it over. I, at least in the past, tended to think that, hey, there's very basics, like such as, discoverability or like price point and value proposition things that are really given to me already. And I don't get to say anything and I just get to roll with what I'm given. But that particular example showed me that that's not true and that you actually, at least to me, it proved to be very effective to revisit those pages because, again, the product evolves, the market also changes slightly, your customers have new needs and things like that. And so I think it's pretty much like, today it may not be valid, but then, you revisit it in a couple months or maybe half a year, and that's very much applicable to the situation. So again, I was a little lost and overwhelmed with this potential options at the same time. But again, I didn't want to peanut butter over everything. Because peanut buttering here, it is going to be hard to measure and hard to see the results. And again, you have to pick your battles, right? Like all the time, it's a prioritization exercise in terms of you probably like I didn't have capacity and like basically resources to try to pursue all of the different channels and all of the different approaches to kind of get momentum going with this growth. So again, thought about the fundamentals and how I could best move the growth needle. So one thing to remember also about this product is that it's an insurance policy, in that the customer would choose the product once based on their requirements that they have for their environment, such as high availability or disaster recovery, and they would typically either never revisit that decision or revisit it super rarely, like typically when their contract ends and they have some, for example, let's say extra price sensitivity, like for example with with pandemics, like different budget cuts and things like that. But typically, again, they don't revisit, so which means that the whole engagement per se, right, is very, very limited. So that's another kind of constraint right there. And so I wanted to make sure that the product is discoverable. That's that it's the value proposition is clear, that the perceived value is clear to the customer, that the price point is fair, if you will, whatever fair means in that situation. And then I think that the onboarding is as frictionless as possible. And the weight here, this like percentage, is my subjective weights on how much impact every aspect had, at least in my mind, when I just started. There are, of course, many more other questions, to ask and many other venues to explore and areas to dive into. And I'm happy to discuss, other nuances during the Q&A or, as I go through the questions in the chat window. So again, the first area that I focused was the discoverability. And so the questions I was asking myself is that, can customers easily find the new product, right? Either in the UI or in the or programmatically. And again, remember this whole Azure portal thing. If you ever had a chance to access that, there's lots of options. There's lots of different features out there, and my product is just one of the kind of options in the drop-down window, effectively, right? So I want to make sure that the customers know where the product is located, how to get it, right? And then as a follow-up question, if we make the discoverability better, so the customers can easily get to that product, would they want to onboard? Would we acquire more customers, right? So one thing was that we used the pretty typical thing that we use this what's new experience for the landing page in the Azure portal to additionally highlight the product in the on the landing page. We also went to the context menu, that's specifically where the customers would choose the the product from the drop down to also help them, kind of nudge them, if you will, in that direction, right? And we also had the ability, by the way, to deploy this experience to a subset of customers. Like you can think of it as an A/B test, but I didn't pursue it at the time because this wasn't really a breaking change that we were introducing. And so we weren't as much worried about the, affecting any other products or experiences. And so that was the kind of the rationale behind not doing actually the A/B test. And then similarly, we did a change to the developers' experiences in the PowerShell, CLI, different SDKs. Wherein, when the customer was signing up for the product, we would highlight the alternative. So there's the default, and then we would highlight the alternative. So basically, essentially think of it as throwing a confirmation to the customer. Hey, do you really want to do that? Because you also have this other thing that you may potentially be interested in. And they would, confirm the operation or maybe change their mind. And again, these two would, UI would mostly pertain to the IT pro type persona. Those who like architects, think of them like IT professionals, architects on the customer side, and then the developers' experiences. Of course, this would be the developer persona. And this kind of we thought that these changes with the kind of mix of the freemium and trials that we still have with Azure in general, we would have basically kind of wider top of the funnel. And so the product kind of is available basically for more customers earlier in their customer journey. And so the metric here was pretty simple as far as the changes, the monitoring the number of new customers. A more drastic venue that I also explored here was to make this new product the default choice. But this idea was disregarded pretty quickly because the thinking was that, sure, this would require an A/B test just to, just for sure, just considering how big of a change that would be for the default experience for the customer. But then the other, I think, aspect to think about, at least that I wanted to think about, was that, well, yes, sure, I have this overarching goal to grow the product and make sure that it's, the customers adopt it and the usage grows, etc. But at the same time, what does it mean? How does that KPI translates to my KPI, to the KPI of the product? And again, since this product is about protecting the customer's data, it's about protecting their service to make sure that it's always up and running and the data is never corruptible, then this KPI to me translates, well, I need to build trust. And so I need to never lose customers' data. I need to never lose customer service. So which means that this product needs to be superior to all other products in that choice for the customer for me to be able to to at least think about making this product a default. And again, at the time, the product was not superior; it was actually inferior to a couple of other options that we had, and that's why that decision to, or at least thinking about making this product a default choice, was out of the conversation, out of the picture. As a net result of this particular changes with the discoverability, it gave us a single-digit month-over-month growth of new customers, and I'm going to talk about this cumulative result later on. So the next step was the value proposition. Again, hand in hand with the discoverability, right? Like I discover the product, but what is it? Like, what does it give me? What kind of value do I get from this product? Given the restrictions of UI and the programmatic user experience, these kind of value proposition things, they need to be short, they need to be concise, they need to be to the point. So this is one restriction. And the other one is that historically, if you check out other public cloud providers, products are typically listed by their names, like, for example, Azure Kubernetes Service or like Amazon Elastic Compute Cloud, things like that, right? Why is it a problem? If you think about from a customer standpoint, they have so many choices all the time, right? Like when they go to the cloud, they have so many different products available, and they don't always understand clearly how what does a product do? Like, sure, we understand that it's compute, but like which type of VM should I be using, or which type of storage in this particular example should I be using, right? And so putting myself into the shoes of the customers, I was trying to, I kind of felt overwhelmed with these options, and I was trying to actually do the other way around. And instead of offering the customer a choice of, hey, just go read the documentation and go figure out how which drop-down option you need, let me ask you a few business-oriented questions like, hey, how much downtime can you potentially sustain, or how much time can your service level agreements provide, or kind of can allow, basically, right? So that kind of conversation. So shifting gears to the business impact, and then when the customer chooses these different options based on their business needs, I would translate those into the most suitable product that's available, in the suite, basically. So that was the idea of how to kind of to approach this whole kind of value proposition piece, right? With that hypothesis in mind, so I worked on this new sign-up flow. And again, idea is exactly the same as, we talked about this high-level goal for me, right? Like to protect the customers and to protect their data. But now I just need to tailor this towards their business need. The blocker there was that, the sign-up flow at the time was undergoing massive changes. Like as a much like a broader global initiative, and so we ended up cutting the UI experiment per se, and instead I worked with the marketing team and the content teams on a few areas. One was that revamping the documentation, describing the products and their capabilities, and we basically got rid of. We had 6 different articles on the subject, and we merged them into one and kind of make it just more consumable and easier to kind of rationalize around, right? I also worked on the collateral for the field and sales and other partner teams, so that I think the idea here was that we need to make sure that our messaging is consistent across all the teams, right? Like, so the product is kind of positioning it one way, and then, we want to make sure that everybody is aligned that's around that kind of product cohesive story, right? So that's the second item that I worked on. And then the last piece, of course, worked extensively with the marketing team in general and various customers to have these various case studies and success stories published on the website, and think of that as a kind of trying to promote that network effect, right? Like testimonials. The customers would come and they would see, why would they want to use that product? And again, this is a very effective method also for the sales team, of course, because they also can go ahead and use these materials for them. Given how many different actions, like small, tiny improvements were made here, it was really hard to tell and measure how basically the exact results of the steps. But I saw another about 2%-ish of customers growth month over month. And, worth noting, I think here is that it was a young product relatively to, other products that we had in the portfolio. And so I think, seeing in general, like the single or even double-digit growth month over month is pretty okay in the beginning. So it's because the scale basically is different. But again, these particular steps here with the value proposition, playing around those positioning and some marketing collateral gave us about 2%, another 2% month over month growth. So the next one was onboarding. Again, the questions to ask how easy it is for the customers, right, to onboard to this new product. And for new and existing. And new means that, brand new installation, and then for existing basically means cannibalizing our other products potentially here. I think that given that we've, already had a few pretty solid pieces together, right, like RAM documentation with lots of how-tos and kind of useful articles, I thought that, I decided to focus basically my attention on onboarding and existing customers specifically. I'm not going into the details of the cannibalization piece per se, other than the fact that it's required to review as part of the business model and perform the in-depth kind of demand forecast exercise and highlight the pros and cons of this approach. So let's just assume that the cannibalization was not a problem in this particular scenario. And I knew that the customers couldn't switch from their existing product to this one easily. It was basically not available at all. So they had to, like, the default answer for Microsoft at the time was like, you have to start from scratch. You have to literally go ahead and manually copy your data from one storage to another storage, and then you'll start over. And I thought at the time that it's a huge adoption blocker. And I checked the number of support requests that we were getting on this topic, and turned out it to be very small. But, I thought, again, this is probably that vicious circle. The customers would come, would ask for the support, would ask for this kind of, migration or upgrade story. We would say no. And then after, 1, 2, 3 months, they would stop coming. And that's why we see so few requests. And so that was the hypothesis at the time. And, I thought that if we offered a basic solution, the number of requests will go up, and, we will basically have better adoption. The result, surprisingly to me, now in retrospect, it's not so surprising, but at the time it was, the number of requests went up initially as the customers discovered the option of, being able to onboard to the new product or to migrate to the new product. But in a couple of months, it went back. and where we started. So basically, there was like a few, I think under 5 requests per month. And based on the discussions where that I had with the customers, they basically didn't appreciate the solution that we came up with, which was very manual, even though it was handled by by Microsoft, basically, so they didn't have to take anything to take care of everything. Still, they didn't have, for example, some of the complaints were we didn't have the scalability. They couldn't, do let's say thousands of requests in parallel. It was time consuming, and they didn't have the ETA, so we couldn't give them the progress bar effectively. We couldn't, the only thing they had was the support engineer would come back and say, we're still doing that. We're still working on that. So with no ETA whatsoever. So that's lack of transparency as well, lack of troubleshooting experience. And again, the customers are, especially these days, the more savvy they become with the cloud platform, the more and more they expect that they would have a fantastic troubleshooting experience, that they would have all the tools and be able to solve it. Much like, again, with a trial, right? Like they are able to use the product themselves, and they're able to troubleshoot it themselves too, especially, given our personas, the developers and then the IT pros, right? So basically all those things, are the customers are so used to all those things having in the cloud. So they're used to being in control of that. And so the solution was good enough for maybe as an internal only tool that, again, now in retrospect, we understand, but it wasn't really ready for the prime time. And as a result, the reputation of that solution also got hit pretty badly. And so we didn't have any kind of negative reviews on Yelp or anything like that. But again, the word of mouth effect still exists here, where, the customers would say, hey, it's really raw. It was really not working for us. And so that kind of the damage to the reputation was definitely there. And I think the hypothesis was decent, but I think that we should have validated with the customers in greater detail to better understand kind of what their ideal solution would look like, so that the MVP that we come up with is actually good enough for them. And I think we didn't really meet the min bar for that MVP. And so the net result of this particular kind of improvements, if you will, was zero help to onboarding, zero help to growth, and some wasted dev work, and potentially, of course, lost revenue. So this was a pretty kind of wasted piece of the whole journey. And then the last one was the price point. Again, the kind of more broad question to ask was, hey, is price a problem at all? And what kind of improvements can we make? And it's a bit kind of oftentimes we shoot for the value-based pricing, trying to convert, right, like the value of the product, like the value the product brings to the table to some kind of monetary value. That's the ideal world, but it's always, super hard. In this particular case, the price was set already, and it was competitive compared to the AWS and GCP. That much I knew, and the question was, what's next, right? And so it can be tempting. It was tempting, at least for me at the time, to look for some sort of drastic change, hoping it'll fix the majority of the stuff. But in my experience, and even though I'm a big fan of the power law, it's not always the case. And so what I did here, instead of trying to kind of come up with super creative solutions, I just wanted to understand what the customers are struggling with when it comes to the pricing. And there were two, based on the surveys, and not only internal Microsoft surveys that we run, but also kind of more public ones. One of the big challenges for the customers with pricing when it comes to these cloud providers is transparency. So they don't know how much they're charged. They know how much they're charged, but they don't know the breakdown. Why am I charged for this? What's the details, and how do I bring this down? And a very typical, for example, situation in storage is that customers know that they're paying for storage itself, right? For the data stored, but they rarely think about that transactions can actually cost them quite a bit. And sometimes they actually generate about 90% of their bill. And so again, the customers have this lack of transparency, and this is an overarching problem, not just for storage, but for the entire public cloud. And so that kind of problem, or that kind of concern from the customers, it drew my attention at the time. And the reason being is that on the other side, right, like my product has a fairly complex pricing structure. Again, data storage, write transactions, read transactions, other operations, things like that. And so, how do I make it a little bit easier, right? And so at the time, what happened, and this again ties back to this whole go broad before you go deep, which we're going to talk about. But at the time, I also knew that our other kind of team, sister team, right? It's kind of think of it as a low-hanging fruit. The other sister team was launching reserved capacity pricing, meaning that the customers would basically pay a certain amount of upfront. And they won't need then to worry about anything. They pay their price, and it's very predictable, and there's a certain amount of like everything rolled into this reserve capacity pricing. And I basically jumped on that train. I thought that again, they have all the business model, they have everything in place already, and I just need to plug in my product. Versus if I were to potentially explore a venue of, hey, let's like revamp the entire pricing structure and, let's try to simplify it or whatever. It's not only affecting my product. I now need to think about the entire ecosystem, and we'll have to come up with a kind of much bigger solution, and it'll probably take way more time in this more time constrained horizon, right? So that was, again, low-hanging fruit, and it provided value to the customers and kind of opens another potentially revenue generation stream for us. So the net of it was reusing, right, someone else's work effectively, and that was super helpful at that time. Having implemented the solution, I've noticed that most of the existing customers would not switch, except a handful. And my reasoning was that they had ongoing contracts, which are quite, again, rare to be reviewed and adjusted on kind of as they go. So I had to make an additional effort to make the customers aware of the solution, so that, basically make sure that they know that they can cut costs where it's applicable. Of course, it does not apply to every scenario, but in some scenarios, they may potentially save some cost. I think at the time, I did notice, though, that about 40% of the new deals and new customers were using this reserved pricing. However, from my growth chart standpoint, because most of those deals were in that whole long-term bucket where the deal would actually, it'll be maybe signed today, but then all the ingestion and all the production will materialize in about 2 years. I'll basically see that uptick in the growth trajectory in about 1 to 2 years. And so immediate contribution to the overall growth was in the order of just about 1%, and we would see more improvements, over time. So combining these four aspects, thank you, Mike. Combining these four aspects of how I approach the growth problem, the product grew about 500x in 2 years. And I think that, it sounds like a lot, but, what does it really mean if you started with zero, right? Like, or near zero, I should say. Like, if you started with zero, you would end up with zero. But if you started near zero and you grow 500x, it doesn't really tell you anything. And even that, the other way to think about it was that what I really, I think, appreciated actually as far as the kind of result of this overall endeavor was that we were able to achieve the steady momentum of about a little under 10% month-over-month growth. And again, just to put this into the perspective, you can see here that it's about doubling every 9 months, right? So again, this is, subjectively can be, one can say that, well, what does a double mean in 9 months? Is it good enough? So again, for me at the time, it was good enough. But I think that the more higher order bit here is that growth trajectory was really steady. And the other piece here is that also where I was not personally, I think, and in large enterprise established companies with very mature products, I was not expecting any hockey stick type situation. Definitely, I would see upticks again once in a while because there's new large customer onboarded and things like that. But I was mostly operating, at least, under the hypothesis that I should not have this hockey stick exponential growth at any point. It'll be more so me kind of trying to improve that rate of growth month over month, right? So that was just the assumption. And the other piece here is that you remember that, how many different changes were made. It's super hard at times to precisely measure the impact and say, hey, I made this, let's say I made this collateral or made this marketing improvements here and there, and that gave me exactly 3.5%, impact on growth. So I just basically made my peace with a certain precision point, and I think that's a pretty fair assumption to make, and pretty fair reasoning, because again, it's a living basically ecosystem of different products, and so it's hard to measure the impact after like all these changes that you're making. A couple of lessons that I've learned throughout this process, and I'm happy to open this to questions afterwards. But the one thing is, of course, that combining the sales-led approach, this heavy sales machinery that we have, with these also interim investments, they definitely give you an edge in the long run, more strategically. You may not see all these effects for more established products, like even if you do go through that same framework as I went through, and it may not have that same effect on your kind of more established kind of product, but at the same time, longer term strategically, that creates that compounding growth machine without you having to rely only on your sales organization, so which is kind of nice. Remember that also comment about the feedback from your large customers, how they skew your product. And I think that again, they try to steer your product the direction, not necessarily away, but in the direction that they wanted to see it going, right? And so what I've learned is that I try to productize and kind of check the hypothesis early on. So what I mean by that is, again, imagine you have this deal with a customer, you sign it today, but it will materialize in 2 years. So in 2 years, the customer is expecting a certain product change that will happen then, should happen by then. And so what I do with this potential request, I start immediately basically going, seeing how it may fit for my other customers or my other scenarios, or maybe it's going to be a completely new market or category. Doesn't really matter. But the idea is that I just try to build around very basic, maybe spec, effectively, like a 1-pager, like a 2-pager, of how this product might look like, not just for that particular customer, but just maybe for a broader market, right? And get it to not to the hands of the customers, but at least go in front of the customers and talk to them about, hey, here's what we think about. How would that be useful to you, for example, and things like that. And so it's potentially, it can be something obvious many customers would actually use, and but then sometimes it may open, like I said, a new, maybe even subcategory, and like a new interesting niche within your markets and within your existing cohorts, and completely maybe even new customers. So and if you have to potentially do this anyway for your product, for this deal to materialize, it may be even conditional, for that contract, that's kind of win-win anyway, right? Like, because if you're doing that already, you might as well think on how you can apply that change and scale. Onboarding turned out to be the hardest part, and it is the hardest part to get right, I think, in my personal experience, because discoverability, value prop, this perfect try-buy experience, everything is great, but at the same time, there's lots of things in the back end that I'm thinking about, like, for example, dependencies, right? Like, how are the customers, whether they have any legacy dependencies, even though, let's say hypothetically, that your product doesn't really require any migration per se or upgrade per se, still customers are using the entire suite of, in this case, Azure product. And so some of them may not even support that new product, or you haven't thought about that. That's because, I don't know, for example, Azure SQL or any other basically solution within the Azure suite may not support this new storage, right, type. And so these dependencies, how do you think about these older APIs, older SDKs the customers are using? And like, especially in larger enterprises with large kind of customers, they are super slow on the change, and it's a habit conversation. It's lots of other conversations there. So keep that in mind. The other piece for me was also upgrade and backward compatibility, right? That's another important aspect. And then migration, of course, is kind of yet another one. And again, and in this particular example with this product, I've been burdened by all three, and it didn't work for me just all quite well. Talk about this briefly. Want to talk again that discoverability and value prop are not set in stone, especially that value prop piece, because sometimes the other product managers they worked it nicely, and it sounds so neat and everything, and it's sometimes I was super nervous basically to go up my chain and say, hey, how about we revisit this whole conversation, because it's not only nervous because, hey, I need to present this kind of drastic potentially change to people who made this decision in the past, and they may not like the idea of me kind of changing it up. But then the other piece is also, if I start this motion, it's a pretty big and drastic change, and how do I pursue the entire organization to make this change? That's it's not a trifle, right? And so again, your customers are overwhelmed, be it consumers or B2B, with the choices, with the number, right, of the options that they have. So it's super important to clearly articulate your value proposition and have that product super discoverable. And again, if that means that you need to revisit those decisions, I think it's perfectly fine. At least I did it, and it wasn't all that. I guess rough in a sense, right? Because your product and the ecosystem and the adjacent environment changes, and so if you took it over, doesn't mean that you don't get to say in it. And then that last piece, that last bit that I mentioned a couple of times already, that you go broad and then deep, and that's what worked for me, because my personal experience in that going broad. And understanding like the adjacent ecosystem, the broader product suite, how they work together, there's different pieces, understanding the market, understanding the different kind of nuances. It's more helpful for the dev team in the long run, because we can always solve a very concrete technical problem with the help of the dev, and we can even make a mistake actually in this tactically, right? Like say we mess up some small piece tactically, that's okay. But if you don't, like if I didn't see that broader long-term picture and broader picture, like strategically, the decisions that that I was making would potentially cripple the product. And so I think that you'll have a better strategic view and lay of the land if you were to go broad rather than deep first. Like even coming back to the pricing conversation, understanding the ecosystem, right, and understanding what are my partner teams, what are my sister teams are working on, helped me tremendously get this low-hanging fruit quickly with very minimal dev effort at the time, versus having to, again, revamp potentially the whole pricing. I think if that wasn't for that, I would probably even drop that entire pricing conversation whatsoever, and I would just focus on something else, because it was too hard, and I didn't have all the capacity to take care of that. And so that was very helpful at the time. So overarching, I guess, lesson of that is that product-led growth, it's not only about SaaS, and it's not one size fits all method. And anybody can achieve their growth, and it's just you can define your path and see how that plays out for you.
Hey, thanks, Art. I don't know if you want to take a look at the questions there. There's 3 of them there.
I see the chat, but I don't see the question. Sorry.
Over on the same menu bar over on the right side at the top.
Yes, I see chat. More giveaways coming soon. Sorry.
But yeah, if you look along the line, the top bar, chat, polls, attendees, Q&A.
Oh, pause. Right? Yes, I can see that. Okay. Q&A. Okay, found it. Sorry. Thank you, Mike. So let's see. Did you find any good ways to illustrate to your management how your team contributions drove the growth you saw in the business? Roberts on the prior SPMs, to find good ways to illustrate to your management how your team's contributions. So I think, Susanna, thanks for the question. So for me, the experience was that I think that having visibility with your with the directors is super important. So that's what I did early on, established this weekly and monthly cadence with my partner team and with my director to make sure that all the results that we're going through and all the impact that we've made is visible and clearly articulated to the team. So yes, absolutely. I think we're at the time. So Dave and Yuteng, I'll take your questions offline, and I'm happy to answer those. I'll just type those in, and we can discuss this later on. Okay. So thank you very much, everyone. Really appreciate you coming. If you have any follow-up questions, please follow up with me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to connect.
Thanks, Art. And again, everybody can head over to the main stage for the next round of giveaways. Thanks again.
Thank you.